"You're not on the list, sir, so you're not getting on that ship." The words landed flat and cold against the morning air as the wind rolled in off the Atlantic, carrying the sharp scent of salt and steel across the naval base at Norfolk, Virginia. Lieutenant Mark Ellison stood firm at the foot of the gangway, one polished shoe angled slightly forward, his posture rigid with the kind of authority that came fresh from promotion and still felt new in his bones. Behind him, the USS Resolute loomed, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer stretching nearly 500 feet of gray steel into the horizon, its hull catching the early light like a blade. Sailors moved in tight formation across the deck above, their voices low, their steps measured, preparing for a ceremony that had already begun to draw a quiet crowd along the pier. Families stood in pressed suits and summer dresses, officers in full dress whites exchanged clipped greetings, and somewhere overhead, a flag snapped hard against its line in the steady 15-knot wind. In front of Ellison stood Thomas Whitaker, 84 years old, 5'10" in worn leather shoes that had seen better decades, his shoulders slightly bent but not broken, his hands steady at his sides. He wore a dark suit, clean, carefully pressed, but unmistakably old, the fabric softened by time, and in his right hand he held a single envelope, edges creased, corners rounded, the kind of paper that didn't belong in a place run by scanners, barcodes, and encrypted credentials. He didn't argue. He didn't step back. He simply looked past the lieutenant, past the gangway, toward the ship itself, as if measuring distance in something other than feet. Ellison followed his gaze for a brief second before snapping back, impatience tightening his jaw. "This is a restricted boarding for invited personnel only," he continued, voice sharper now, louder just enough for a few nearby sailors to glance over. "If you don't have a digital clearance or your name isn't on my manifest, you need to clear the area." The envelope didn't move in Whitaker's hand. For a moment, it seemed like the wind itself paused around him, tugging at loose threads of his sleeve but failing to pull him away. A pair of young seamen near the security post exchanged a quick look, one of them shifting his weight as if uncertain whether to intervene or pretend not to notice. The hum of activity along the pier continued, but thinner now, stretched by the quiet tension forming at the base of the gangway. Whitaker finally spoke, his voice low, gravelly, the kind of voice shaped by years that didn't need to raise itself to be heard. "I'm here for the Resolute," he said. No explanation. No apology. Just a statement, placed gently between them like something solid. Ellison exhaled through his nose, a faint, dismissive sound. "Everyone here is," he replied, already reaching for the tablet clipped to his side, tapping through a list of names scrolling in clean digital rows. His finger moved quickly, efficiently, the glow of the screen reflecting faintly in his eyes. Whitaker watched the motion, not the device, not the data, just the movement, like he'd seen something similar before, in a different form, under different conditions. The lieutenant paused, scrolled back once, then again, his expression flattening. "No Whitaker," he said. He didn't look up right away. No Thomas, no T, no initials. Nothing. The wind picked up again, snapping the flag harder now, the sound echoing faintly against the ship's hull. Somewhere on deck, a boatswain's whistle cut through the air, short, precise, unmistakable. Whitaker's eyes flickered upward at the sound, just for a second, then settled back on the gangway. He adjusted his grip on the envelope, the paper crinkling softly, almost lost beneath the noise of the harbor. Ellison finally looked up, meeting his gaze directly this time, and whatever he saw there didn't slow him down, it hardened him. "Sir," he said, more formal now, but no less firm, "you're going to have to step aside." Whitaker didn't move. Not forward. Not back. Just stood there, between the wind and the steel, as if he'd already crossed a line no list could measure. The envelope in Thomas Whitaker's hand shifted slightly as the wind pressed against it, the paper bending but not breaking, the edges whispering against his fingers like something that had traveled a long way to be here. He did not look at Lieutenant Ellison anymore. Instead, his eyes drifted again toward the ship, tracing the line of the hull, the gangway, the deck above where sailors moved with quiet precision, each step measured, each motion rehearsed. There was a rhythm to it, one that most people never noticed, but to him it was familiar in a way that settled deep into the chest rather than the mind. Ellison cleared his throat, louder this time, shifting his stance as if the lack of reaction was beginning to irritate him more than outright resistance would have. "Sir, I am giving you a direct order to clear the boarding area," he said, his voice now carrying the clipped tone of someone invoking regulation rather than conversation. A couple standing a few yards back turned their heads, the woman's hand tightening slightly around the man's arm as she watched the exchange unfold. The low murmur along the pier softened, not entirely stopping, but bending around the moment like water around a stone. Whitaker finally moved, but not in the way Ellison expected. He lifted the envelope slowly, turning it over in his hands as if confirming something written there had not changed in the last few seconds. The paper caught the light for a brief instant, revealing a name written in careful, deliberate strokes, ink faded but still legible. His thumb brushed across it, not to clean it, but as if recognizing it by touch alone. "This is where I am supposed to be," he said quietly. There was no defiance in the words, no challenge, just a simple certainty that did not match the situation in front of him. Ellison exhaled sharply, the sound almost a laugh but without any humor behind it. "That is not how this works," he replied, stepping closer by half a pace, closing the space just enough to assert control. "You do not just show up with a piece of paper and walk onto a United States Navy destroyer. There are procedures. There are security protocols. And right now, you are standing in violation of both." Whitaker listened, his expression unchanged, his posture still. If the words reached him, they did not leave a mark. A gull cried somewhere overhead, circling once before disappearing beyond the ship's mast. The wind shifted direction, carrying a colder edge now, tugging at the hem of Whitaker's coat. He adjusted it absent-mindedly, smoothing it down with a motion that spoke more of habit than necessity. Ellison followed the movement, his eyes narrowing slightly, searching for something that would justify ending the interaction quickly. He glanced once more at the envelope, then at the man holding it, as if weighing how much longer to tolerate the disruption. "Last warning," he said, his tone lower now, controlled but firm. "Step away from the gangway, or I will have you escorted off the pier." The word escorted hung in the air, heavier than the rest, drawing a brief silence from those close enough to hear it. Whitaker looked at him then, really looked, his pale blue eyes steady and clear, carrying a depth that did not rise to the surface but was impossible to ignore once noticed. For a fraction of a second, Ellison hesitated, though he could not have explained why. It passed quickly. Authority reasserted itself in his posture, in the set of his jaw. Whitaker gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if he had heard something familiar in the tone rather than the words. He lowered his gaze back to the envelope, holding it a little closer now, the paper creasing softly under his grip, and remained exactly where he was, as the ship loomed behind them and the morning continued to unfold without waiting for either of them to decide what would happen next. The stillness did not break, it thickened, settling into the space between them like something unseen but undeniable, and Lieutenant Ellison felt it before he understood it, a subtle shift in the air that had nothing to do with the wind coming off the water. He straightened slightly, adjusting the line of his uniform as if posture alone could restore the clear boundary he was used to enforcing, then reached forward with controlled precision and took the envelope from Thomas Whitaker's hand. The motion was deliberate, not aggressive, but firm enough to assert that the situation was no longer optional. The paper felt lighter than he expected, almost fragile, the kind of thing that did not belong in a place governed by steel, systems, and exact procedures. He turned it over once, scanning the front again, his eyes narrowing at the handwritten name as if it might rearrange itself into something recognizable if he stared long enough. Thomas Whitaker, he read aloud, the syllables measured, testing them against memory and finding nothing. A few nearby sailors slowed their pace, not stopping outright but drifting closer under the pretense of routine movement, their attention drawn by the tone rather than the words. Ellison's thumb pressed against the seal, hesitating for half a second before he slid a finger beneath the flap and opened it with a soft tear that sounded louder than it should have. Inside, There was no official document, no printed authorization, no insignia stamped in gold or embossed with rank. Just a single photograph, black and white, its edges worn smooth, and a folded sheet of paper tucked behind it. He pulled the photograph out first, holding it up instinctively toward the light. 5 men stood shoulder to shoulder on what looked like the deck of a much older vessel, their uniforms different, their posture less rigid but somehow heavier, as if they carried something not visible in the frame. Ellison leaned in slightly, studying their faces, searching for any sign of recognition, any anchor point that would justify the disruption standing in front of him. There was none. To him, they were just men from another time, frozen in a moment that had no place in the present. He flipped the photograph over, his finger brushing across the faded ink on the back. "For the man who brought us home," he read quietly, the words slower this time, less certain. A faint crease formed between his brows, not from understanding, but from the absence of it. He lowered the photo just enough to glance at Whitaker, who stood exactly as he had before, watching without reaching, without reclaiming what had been taken from his hand. There was no urgency in him, no sign that the contents of that envelope needed to be defended or explained. That, more than anything, unsettled Ellison in a way he did not expect. He cleared his throat again, louder now, as if sound itself could push the moment back into something manageable. "This does not prove anything," he said, though the edge in his voice had shifted, thinner now, less certain of its footing. He slid the photograph back halfway into the envelope but kept the folded paper in his hand, unfolding it with a sharper motion, determined to find something concrete, something that could end this. The paper opened with a faint crackle, revealing a single line written across the top in the same careful handwriting, Greywater 1. The words meant nothing to him. They should have meant nothing. And yet, something about the way they sat there, simple and unadorned, made him pause just a fraction longer than necessary. Behind him, a young petty officer had stopped completely now, his gaze fixed on the paper in Ellison's hand, his expression tightening as if he had just heard something he was not supposed to hear. The wind moved again, lifting the edge of the document slightly, and Ellison instinctively pressed it flat, his grip firmer than before. "Sir," he began again, forcing the authority back into his tone, though it did not land quite the same, "you cannot board this vessel." But even as he said it, the certainty behind the words had begun to erode, not visibly, not enough for most to notice, but just enough that the moment no longer belonged entirely to him. The words lingered in the air, thinner now, stretched between authority and something else that Lieutenant Ellison could not quite define, and for a brief moment, no one moved, not the sailors nearby, not the small group of civilians watching from a distance, not even the gulls that had been circling overhead just moments before. The folded paper remained in Ellison's hand, the words Greywater 1 resting against his palm like a quiet weight that refused to explain itself. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, then slid the paper back into the envelope with a motion that was more controlled than confident. "That does not change anything," he said, though the statement sounded rehearsed now, like something repeated to maintain order rather than reflect truth. "Thomas." Whitaker watched him without interruption, his expression unchanged, his posture still carrying that same quiet certainty that had not shifted since he first stepped onto the pier. The wind moved through again, colder this time, pressing against the side of the destroyer and sending a low metallic hum along the hull that resonated faintly underfoot. Somewhere above, a voice called out a timing check, crisp and professional, followed by the measured response of another sailor, the ceremony continuing on schedule despite the disruption below. Ellison glanced up instinctively, then back down, as if the presence of structure overhead could reinforce the decision he was about to make. "You are holding up a restricted operation," he continued, his tone tightening again as he reached for familiar ground. "This is not a public event, and you do not have verified clearance." He extended the envelope back toward Whitaker, not as an offering, but as a dismissal, a final gesture meant to close the interaction. Whitaker accepted it without hesitation, his fingers closing around the worn edges with the same steady grip as before, as if nothing of importance had been taken or returned. For a moment, he looked down at it, not reading, not checking, just acknowledging its presence, then lifted his gaze again toward the ship. I understand your position, he said quietly. The words were calm, measured, almost courteous, but they did not carry agreement. Ellison's jaw tightened slightly at the response, the lack of resistance somehow more frustrating than open defiance. He shifted his stance again, preparing to escalate, to call over security personnel, to end this in a way that restored the clear line between protocol and exception. But before he could speak, a voice from behind him cut through the moment, not loud, but urgent in a way that did not need volume to be felt. "Sir," Petty Officer Daniel Price said, stepping forward from where he had been standing just behind the security line, his eyes fixed not on Ellison, but on the envelope now back in Whitaker's hand. Ellison turned sharply, irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. "Not now, Petty Officer," he said, the edge returning to his voice. "I am handling this." Price hesitated for a fraction of a second, the training to defer warring with something deeper, something that had been triggered the moment he saw those words on the paper. "Sir," he repeated, this time more firmly, though still controlled, "I think you might want to take a closer look at that name." The suggestion hung there, simple, direct, and completely out of place in the rigid flow of command. Ellison stared at him, disbelief flickering across his expression, not at the content, but at the fact that it had been said at all. Around them, the subtle attention of those nearby sharpened, the quiet observation shifting into something more focused, more deliberate. Whitaker did not move. He did not intervene. He simply stood there, the envelope resting in his hand once more, the wind tugging lightly at its edge, as if the moment itself was waiting for someone else to recognize what had already been placed in front of them. Ellison let out a slow breath, the decision point settling in, and for the first time since the encounter began, he looked not at the situation, not at the protocol, but at the possibility that something about it was not what it appeared to be, and that possibility, small as it was, began to press against the certainty he had been holding onto since the very first word was spoken. The suggestion did not fade, it settled, quiet but persistent, and Lieutenant Ellison felt it pressing at the edge of his focus in a way that protocol did not account for, something that did not belong in the clean structure of orders and responses. He looked back at Petty Officer Daniel Price, studying him now instead of dismissing him, noticing the tension in the younger man's posture, the way his eyes stayed locked on the envelope as if it carried more weight than paper should. Ellison followed that gaze, slower this time, his attention returning to Thomas Whitaker and the object resting in his hand. The wind lifted the corner of the envelope again, and for a brief moment, the folded paper inside shifted just enough to reveal the inked words once more. Greywater 1. Ellison's jaw tightened, not in rejection this time, but in thought. He reached out again, less abruptly than before, and Whitaker, without hesitation, placed the envelope back into his hand. There was no resistance, no hesitation, just that same quiet acceptance that seemed to ignore the authority being exercised over him. Ellison opened it again, more carefully now, as if the act itself required a different kind of attention. He pulled the photograph free once more, holding it closer to his face, studying the 5 men again, not as strangers this time, but as something he might have missed on the first look. Their expressions were not posed in the way modern photographs often were. There was no attempt at perfection, no adjustment of posture for appearance. They stood as they were, shoulders slightly uneven, eyes steady, carrying something unspoken that the camera had not quite captured but had not erased either. Ellison's gaze shifted from one face to another, slower now, searching for a pattern, a detail, anything that would connect them to the present standing before him. He found none, but the absence felt different this time, less like dismissal and more like a gap he did not yet understand. He flipped the photograph over again, reading the line on the back once more, each word landing more deliberately than before. For the man who brought us home. He let the sentence sit there, not dismissing it immediately, not explaining it away. Behind him, the subtle movements along the pier had nearly stopped. Conversations had thinned to murmurs, footsteps slowed, attention drawn not by noise but by the quiet shift in tone that had begun to ripple outward. Ellison unfolded the paper again, smoothing it flat with his palm, his eyes fixed on the words Greywater 1. "What is this supposed to be?" he asked, though the question lacked the edge it had carried earlier. It was not accusation anymore. It was uncertainty. Whitaker did not answer right away. He watched Ellison with that same steady gaze, then looked past him again, toward the ship, as if the answer existed somewhere beyond the immediate moment. "It was not supposed to be anything," he said finally, his voice low, even, carrying a weight. That did not rise in volume but settled deeper instead. It just was. The response did not clarify anything in a practical sense, and yet it shifted something all the same. Ellison exhaled slowly, his grip on the paper loosening slightly as he processed the words, not understanding them, but no longer able to dismiss them outright. He glanced back at Price, who had not moved, whose expression remained tight with recognition he had not yet fully voiced. The chain of command held, but it was beginning to strain under something intangible. Ellison looked down at the name on the envelope again, Thomas Whitaker, written in that same careful hand, and for the first time since the encounter began, he felt the weight of not knowing press harder than the comfort of being certain. The wind moved across the pier once more, carrying the distant sound of preparation from the deck above, the ceremony continuing on its precise schedule, unaware that below, something quiet and unrecognized was beginning to shift the ground beneath it. The words did not explain themselves, but they did not disappear either, and as Lieutenant Ellison stood there with the paper still open in his hand, something quieter than confusion began to take hold, something older than protocol, something that did not rely on lists or clearance codes to exist. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a faint metallic echo from the hull of the destroyer, a low resonance that seemed to hum through the pier itself, and for a brief moment, Thomas Whitaker closed his eyes, not in fatigue, but in recognition, as if that sound belonged to a place he had not truly left. The envelope rested lightly in Ellison's grip now, no longer held like evidence, but like an object that required careful handling, and he found himself looking at the photograph again without meaning to, his gaze drawn back to the 5 figures standing shoulder to shoulder in a time that did not match the present around him. There was something in the way they stood, something unpolished but exact, something that did not need explanation because it had already been lived. Whitaker's voice came again, softer this time, not directed at Ellison, not even fully anchored in the present moment. It was the kind of night where the ocean did not wait for orders, he said, his eyes no longer on the lieutenant, but somewhere beyond the ship, beyond the horizon itself. Ellison did not interrupt. He did not ask for clarification. The words settled into the air, and for reasons he could not fully explain, he allowed them to remain. The deck was slick, Whitaker continued, his tone even, steady, carrying no urgency, only memory. Not from rain. From the kind of storm that does not show up on any forecast. Systems were failing one by one. Lights went dark. Radios went silent. Everything that was supposed to guide us stopped working. The pier seemed quieter now, as if even the movement of the sailors had adjusted to the shift in the moment. A few more had turned their attention toward the base of the gangway, drawn not by raised voices, but by the absence of them. Whitaker's hands remained at his sides, but there was a slight tightening in his fingers, not from strain, but from holding on to something that had never really left him. "We were not supposed to be there," he said, almost as if stating a simple fact rather than revealing something hidden. That operation did not have a name anyone could say out loud. It did not exist on paper the way things usually do. Ellison felt the words before he processed them, the idea of something unrecorded, something outside the systems he trusted, pressing against the framework he relied on. He looked down at the paper again, at the words Greywater 1, and for the first time, they no longer seemed like nothing. One of the engines went quiet, Whitaker continued, his voice steady, measured, not dramatic, not seeking attention, simply unfolding. Then another. The ship started to drift, not forward, not back, just away. And there were men still below, waiting for someone to make a decision that would not come through any chain of command. The wind moved again, stronger now, tugging at coats, at uniforms, at the edges of the moment itself. Ellison did not speak. He did not reassert authority. He stood there, the envelope in his hand, listening in a way he had not intended to. "So we stopped waiting," Whitaker said. We moved because there was no one left to tell us not to. The words did not rise, did not demand attention, but they settled with a weight that could not be dismissed. Ellison looked up at him then, really looked, and for the first time, the man standing in front of him was no longer just an unlisted name, no longer just a disruption to procedure. He was something else, something not yet defined, but no longer ignorable. And as the sound of preparation continued faintly from the deck above, the distance between what Ellison knew and what he was beginning to understand grew just enough to make certainty feel incomplete. The silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt loaded, as if the air itself had begun to carry something heavier than the cold wind sweeping across the pier, and Petty Officer Daniel Price felt it more clearly than anyone else standing there, because unlike the others, he had heard fragments of something like this before, not in official briefings, not in manuals, but in passing comments, in half-finished stories told by older chiefs who stopped talking the moment someone asked for details. His eyes moved again to the words Greywater 1, then to the photograph, then back to Thomas Whitaker, and the pieces did not fully connect, but they aligned just enough to trigger a certainty that could not be ignored. He stepped back slightly, just enough to create space without drawing attention, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his movements controlled, deliberate, practiced in the kind of discretion that did not require instruction. Lieutenant Ellison noticed the motion out of the corner of his eye but did not immediately react, his attention still caught between the paper in his hand and the man in front of him. Price turned slightly, angling his body away from the center of the pier, shielding the screen from view as he scrolled quickly through a short list of contacts, stopping on one name that most enlisted personnel would never even consider calling directly. He hesitated for less than a second, then pressed the call button and lifted the phone to his ear. The line rang once, then twice, each tone stretching longer than it should have, until finally a voice answered, calm, measured, unmistakably controlled. "Office of Admiral Harlan," the voice said. Price swallowed once, steadying himself, aware of the line he was about to cross. "Petty Officer Daniel Price, sir," he said quietly, keeping his tone respectful but firm. "I apologize for the direct call, but I believe there is a situation you need to be aware of." There was a brief pause on the other end, not dismissal, not impatience, just a shift in attention. "Go ahead," the voice replied. Price glanced back toward the gangway, watching as Lieutenant Ellison stood with the envelope still open, the photograph visible between his fingers, Thomas Whitaker unmoving in front of him. "There is a man at the boarding point," Price said, choosing his words carefully. 84 years old, civilian attire, no digital clearance on file. Another pause, shorter this time. "Then why are you calling me, Petty Officer?" the voice asked, still calm, but sharper now. Price exhaled slowly, his grip tightening slightly on the phone. "Because of the name, sir," he said. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint sound of boots on metal from the deck above, the ceremony continuing, unaware. "What name?" the voice asked. Price did not hesitate this time. "Thomas Whitaker," he said. The effect was immediate, though silent. The line did not disconnect. There was no verbal response. But the absence of sound on the other end changed, thickened, stretched into something unmistakable. Price's eyes narrowed slightly as he waited, his instincts confirming what his training could not explain. When the voice returned, it was different, lower, more focused. "Repeat that," it said. "Thomas Whitaker," Price answered, steady now. Another pause, longer than before, followed by a sound that could have been movement, a chair shifting, something set down quickly out of frame. "Where is he?" the voice asked. Price turned his head slightly, confirming what he already knew. "At the gangway to the Resolute, sir," he said. This time, the response came without delay. "No one touches him," the voice said, the calm replaced by something firm, absolute. "Do you understand me, Petty Officer?" Price straightened instinctively, even though he was alone on the call. "Yes, sir," he replied. The line went quiet for a fraction of a second, then the final words came, precise, controlled, carrying weight far beyond their volume. "I am coming down." The call ended. Price lowered the phone slowly, his eyes lifting back toward the scene at the base of the gangway, where Lieutenant Ellison still stood holding the envelope, unaware that the ground beneath the moment had just shifted in a way no protocol could reverse. The call ended, but its weight did not. It moved outward, invisible but immediate, and somewhere above the pier, beyond the line of sight of those gathered at the gangway, something shifted in the rhythm of the ship itself. On the deck of the USS Resolute, the ceremony had already begun to take form, officers aligned in precise formation, a podium set against the backdrop of gray steel and open sky, a row of flags snapping sharply in the wind as a master of ceremonies prepared to speak. Admiral Robert Harlan stood near the front, his dress uniform immaculate, every ribbon and insignia placed with exact care, his posture straight, his presence commanding without effort. He held a small set of notes in one hand, the paper steady despite the wind, his gaze moving once across the assembled crowd before settling forward, ready to begin. Then a junior aide stepped close, too close for a formal interruption, his movement quick but controlled, leaning just enough to speak without carrying his voice beyond the Admiral. "Sir," the aide said quietly, "there is a call you need to hear." Harlan did not turn immediately, his attention still anchored to the moment in front of him, but there was a subtle shift in his expression, a recognition that the interruption itself carried weight. "Make it quick," he replied under his breath. The aide hesitated for only a fraction of a second, then spoke the words that had already begun to ripple through the lower levels of the command chain. "Thomas Whitaker is at the gangway, sir." The effect was immediate and absolute. The notes in Harlan's hand lowered by an inch, not dropped, not fumbled, just lowered, as if the words had physically altered the balance of the moment. For a heartbeat, nothing else changed. The wind continued, the flags snapped, the officers remained at attention. But inside that stillness, something had shifted completely. Harlan's eyes did not blink. They fixed forward, but they were no longer seeing the ceremony. They were looking through it, past it, to something that existed decades before the ship beneath his feet had ever been commissioned. "Say that again," he said quietly, his voice controlled, but no longer neutral. "Thomas Whitaker, sir," the aide repeated, more carefully this time, aware now of the weight behind the name. The Admiral's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, not in confusion, but in recognition. The kind that did not need confirmation. The kind that did not fade with time. He did not ask for credentials. He did not ask for clarification. He did not ask why. Instead, he turned. The movement was small, but it broke the structure of the moment in a way that did not go unnoticed. A colonel standing nearby shifted, uncertain. The master of ceremonies paused mid-preparation, his hand hovering near the microphone. A ripple of quiet confusion moved through the assembled officers, subtle, restrained, but present. Harlan stepped away from the podium without a word, handing his notes to the aide without looking at him, his focus already elsewhere. "Hold the ceremony," he said, his voice low, but carrying enough authority that it did not need to be repeated. The words moved outward instantly, passed from one officer to another, the structure of the event pausing in place like a breath held too long. Harlan did not wait for acknowledgement. He moved toward the gangway with purpose, his stride measured but faster than protocol would normally allow, each step closing the distance between the present and something long buried beneath it. Below, on the pier, Lieutenant Ellison still stood with the envelope in his hand, unaware of the shift taking place above him, unaware that the name he had read only minutes ago had already reached the highest level of command. Petty Officer Price watched the deck, his eyes tracking the movement he could not yet fully see but could feel approaching. And Thomas Whitaker remained where he had been from the beginning, quiet, still, the wind moving around him, as if he had never needed to go anywhere at all. The first sign was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was simply the sound of footsteps on metal, measured, deliberate, descending from the deck above, and one by one, heads along the pier turned toward the gangway as Admiral Robert Harlan came into view, his presence unmistakable even before the insignia on his uniform could be clearly seen. Conversations stopped without being told to stop. Movement slowed without command. The structure of the morning shifted around him as if the space itself recognized the authority he carried. Lieutenant Ellison straightened immediately, instinct taking over, his grip tightening on the envelope as he stepped back half a pace, creating space where none had existed before. He did not yet understand why the Admiral was here, but the fact that he was changed everything. Harlan did not look at anyone else as he reached the base of the gangway. His eyes moved once across the small gathering, past the sailors, past the civilians, past the officers, until they settled on the man standing quietly at the center of it all. Thomas Whitaker. For a moment, nothing else existed. The wind continued to move, the ship continued to hum, but between the two men, there was only recognition. Harlan slowed, not out of uncertainty, but out of something deeper, something that carried weight across decades. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to see every line in Whitaker's face, every year that had passed since the last time they had stood within arm's reach of one another. The Admiral's posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, the rigid precision of ceremony giving way to something more personal, more grounded. Then, without a word, he removed his cap. The motion was unhurried, deliberate, and it carried through the air like a signal no one needed to be taught. He brought his hand up in a clean, formal salute, but there was nothing routine about it. It was not the salute of rank. Acknowledging rank. It was the salute of a man acknowledging a debt that had never been repaid. The effect was immediate. Around them, sailors straightened, officers froze, conversations vanished completely. Lieutenant Ellison felt it like a physical shift, the realization hitting not in a single moment, but in a series of quiet understandings stacking on top of each other, each one heavier than the last. The envelope in his hand no longer felt like paper. It felt like something he had not been meant to hold at all. Whitaker did not return the salute immediately. He looked at Harlan, his expression unchanged, his eyes steady, carrying the same quiet depth they had held from the beginning. Then, slowly, he nodded once, not as a subordinate, not as a gesture of protocol, but as acknowledgement. Only then did he raise his hand, his movement slower, shaped by time, but no less precise, returning the salute with a calm that did not need to prove itself. Harlan lowered his hand first, stepping forward the final distance between them, his voice low when he spoke, but carrying clearly in the silence that surrounded them. "You made it," he said. Whitaker gave the faintest hint of a smile, something that barely touched the surface but changed everything beneath it. "I said I would," he replied. The words were simple, but they settled into the moment with the weight of something kept, something remembered. Harlan glanced briefly at the envelope still in Ellison's hand, then back to Whitaker. "He did not know," he said quietly, not as an excuse, but as a statement of fact. Whitaker's gaze shifted once toward Ellison, not with judgment, not with resentment, but with a kind of understanding that carried no need for correction. "He did his job," Whitaker said. Ellison felt the words more than he heard them, the tension in his chest loosening in a way he had not expected, replaced by something quieter, something heavier, something closer to respect. Harlan turned slightly, his voice returning to command, but carrying a different tone now. "Lieutenant," he said. Ellison snapped to attention. "Sir." "Escort Mr. Whitaker aboard," Harlan continued, the words clear, final. Ellison nodded once, sharp, precise. "Yes, sir." He stepped aside fully this time, not just making space, but opening the path, the gesture no longer about control, but about recognition. Whitaker moved forward, his step steady as he approached the gangway, the same distance that had been blocked minutes ago now completely clear. As he placed his foot on the first step, the ship seemed to settle around him, the sound of wind and steel blending into something quieter, something almost respectful. He paused for just a second, his hand brushing lightly against the railing, as if confirming that the place was real, that the years between then and now had not erased it entirely. Then he continued upward, not looking back, not needing to. Behind him, the ceremony waited. The ship waited. And for the first time that morning, everything felt exactly where it was supposed to be.